The last time we had looked at the beginning of the Battle at Vicksburg, as Grant tried to maneuver his way in position to conquer this last remaining bastion on the Mississippi River, which would open up the Mississippi River for the Union and separate the Confederacy. His initial efforts failed because of the great position that Vicksburg enjoyed as a fort overlooking the river, the Mississippi River. But eventually Grant was able to maneuver his men around, going down through the swamps on the west side of Vicksburg, taking boats then across the river to the eastern side, conquering some smaller outposts on the eastern side of Vicksburg, and then laid siege to the city. And that's where we're going to leave it as we now go into 1863. And we return back east in the beginning of 1863. Actually, we're going to move ahead to May of that year. So in your notes, go to your eastern section of the notes, and we will look at Chancellorsville. The next military campaign in the east is Chancellorsville. I have it as letter J. That may not be exactly what you have, because in my notes here I have letter L. So whatever letter seems to come next in, it doesn't really matter that much as long as you've got it organized. We saw earlier that Fighting Joe Hooker had been put in charge of the Union forces in the east, as Lincoln continues to have a rotating group of generals from which he is choosing, as no one seems to be able to have a victory against particularly Lee. Hooker was a capable general, but he was a braggart. He declared, "May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none." So rather assuming that he would be victorious over Lee. He returned to the Fredericksburg area with a huge army of 130,000 to crush Lee's army. Lee had less than half of that amount. And so he had to come up with a daring strategy in order to defeat Hooker. And what he did is he divided his army into 3 parts. Now, before he engaged in this battle, he did meet together with his trusted friend, fellow General Stonewall Jackson, seen meeting here together. Jackson was not only a very capable military leader, but also became a friend of Lee, both holding a strong Christian faith. Here's another painting of Generals Lee in the center, Jackson here, and the ever-plumed, who would that be? Always wore a plume in his hat. Jeff Stewart. Right, Jeff Stewart, the cavalry commander. And then here is the last meeting between Lee and Jackson before he sends Jackson on his way, because that's what he's going to do. Lee's going to divide his army into 3 parts, half of it flanking the Union position under the command of Stonewall Jackson. And here we find Jackson leading his troops there on May 2nd, 1863, just before the fighting begins. So the plan of Lee is to flank the Union position, and of course that if you can flank a position back in these times, that is a way that you can defeat the enemy very easily. Yes.
Can you turn the font to white? It's really hard to see. You can't read the first half.
I will have to. You think white would be better? What is down here? I don't know if it's because of the sunlight filtering in or what makes it difficult. Let's try white. We'll see.
I'm just doing my best. Triggered.
No, it's irritating.
You think I was
Oh no. Do it again, do it again.
He's trying to see you again.
I really couldn't do that. Oh, that's
Okay, that's better?
I got into the picture of
I was doing the twist and I see it. Okay.
So Stonewall Jackson was able to flank Hooker, and Hooker was not able to recover from that maneuver. After 3 days of intensive fighting, Hooker retreated. When Lee commended Jackson for his performance, Stonewall replied, "General Lee is very kind, but he should give praise to God," indicating Jackson's faith. He was one who didn't want to take credit himself, but to give glory to God. The outcome of this battle we'll get to in a moment. First of all, here's a painting of the 8th Pennsylvania Cavalry at Chancellorsville, fighting in a losing cause. And this is Lee at Chancellorsville the next day, parading in victory. The outcomes of the battle were several. First of all, it was a Confederate victory, but it was marred by the tragic loss of Jackson. Jackson had gone out in the evening of May 2nd to see where the Union troops were. They were somewhat fearful of a night attack, and so Jackson was out checking where the lines were to see that there was not going to be such an attack. And on his way back through his own lines, the people that were guarding the Confederate position mistook Jackson and his fellow soldiers as being Union soldiers that were attacking, and so shot at them. They hit Jackson, requiring the amputation of his left arm. As his arm was amputated, or having been amputated, Lee remarked thusly, "He has lost his left arm, and I have lost my right." What did he mean by that, Joey?
Like, Stonewall was like his right-hand man.
Yeah, exactly. Very sad day, and then especially when a few days later Jackson succumbed to pneumonia. One of probably the major killer people in hospitals. You went for one thing, you end up getting pneumonia. Same thing on the battlefield. He, in trying to recover from his amputation, contracted pneumonia. Fortunately, they were able to get word to his wife. His wife was able to join him before he died. And he died on May 10th, 1863, fulfilling his wish to die on a Sunday. As he lay there dying, he said this, "Let us pass over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." So apparently what he was seeing as he was dying was that there was paradise on the other side of the river. He said, "Let us pass over." He was ready to go. The accumulated victories of the Confederate States resulted in several consequences. Now, as a result of the death of Jackson, that meant that Longstreet was promoted to the place that Jackson had held. Longstreet became Lee's right-hand man from this point on. And we're going to see how that influences the next major battle. Some of the other outcomes of the Battle of Chancellorsville, besides the loss of Jackson, was, first of all, the Union war aim of the capture of Richmond was completely frustrated. Remember, that had been that was the initial war aim, was capture Richmond. And it had been one of the 3 major war aims throughout the war, capture Richmond. And yet they had failed to do that time after time after time. The only Union victory was the disputed stalemate at Antietam, which, remember, the Union claimed as a victory only because the Confederate Army left, not because they actually defeated them. So the Union really has not won a battle in the East at all. So, Chancellorsville is another victory for the Confederacy. And that raised the morale of the South. At the same time, lowered the morale of the North. Southern hope for independence lay in the fact that all that was needed to win was not to defeat the North, but for them to give up. All the Confederacy has to do is to fight long enough that the Northern people and the Northern, maybe even military, will say, that's enough, we're done, we're tired, it's too great of a cost, let's just let the Southern states go. That's what their hope is. Thirdly, the longer that the South held out and the more victories they've accumulated, the more likely they were to receive foreign recognition and aid, especially from Britain. You know, Great Britain still is smarting from the fact that they had been defeated by the United States in the War of 1812. Not that much before this time. Only 40 years, 50 years. And so, and that was largely, you know, coming from Washington, D.C., you know, that's the United States. The Confederate States are not really considering themselves a part of that anymore. And so Great Britain's looking for an opportunity to get back at the United States. But the Confederate States have to show to Great Britain and other nations that they can make it, that they can survive. And the longer they can keep surviving, the more chance they have of getting that recognition and maybe even foreign aid from Great Britain. You know that in the War of Independence, foreign aid was essential. If the French did not help us in our War for Independence, we would not have won that war. And the Confederate States are hoping for the same kind of aid from Great Britain this time against the United States. March 30th of 1863, President Lincoln proclaimed a national fast, saying that as a nation, quote, we have forgotten God. We have forgotten the gracious hand which preserved us, and have vainly imagined in the deceitfulness of our hearts that all these blessings were produced by some superior wisdom and virtue of our own. President Lincoln showed a definite spiritual understanding in a lot of ways during this war. An understanding that he didn't seem to have at the beginning of the war. I think he entered the presidency as what would be called a skeptic. Someone who believed in Christianity in general, but did not believe the Bible necessarily in particular, especially the miracles. But during the war, he seems to have changed. And many point to the death of his son Todd while he was in office as a crisis experience in his life, and it's possibly that brought him to a true faith in Jesus Christ, because he seems to show that in the latter part of his presidency. But next we come to the turning point. The turning point in the war is the Battle of Gettysburg. But before we get there, we want to go back to the western side and see what's happening in Vicksburg, because that is going to have an effect on what he decides in the east. So, try to make that white for you. Here we are. Mostly. All right. Grant's first attack on the city in December of 1862 failed, but in the process he was able to get in position to lay siege. He had tried to dig a canal that would float his gunboats and troop transports along the bayous, swamps, and streams surrounding the city, and all of these attempts failed. He then engaged in what was a risky maneuver. and that is to do just as I had suggested before. He's going to attempt to float his gunboats past Vicksburg from north to south down the Mississippi River at night, quietly, so that they don't know that he's going by and avoid the firepower coming from the fort. At the same time, he wants to bring his troops from up here and march them down through the swamps down to a point here, and having floated his boats down, then use those to transport his men across the river. It would take a number of trips. And then once he gets over here, and you can see the dates, are March 31st, April 30th, he finally gets down here. It takes about a month to go down through these swamps. You can imagine that, marching through swamps every day. And crosses the river. The Battle of Fort Gibson, May 1st. Other battles out here, May 12th, May 16th, May 14th. And so he's able to capture the railroad going into Vicksburg and cut off any supplies coming into Vicksburg. And that enables him then to set up the siege of Vicksburg, which lasts from May 18th to July 4th. Now, this is all going on, and Lee knows it. Lee knows that Vicksburg is in a very difficult situation. So what Lee intends to do is to try to draw away from that. Here we have the indication that the defenses were too strong to assault, so Grant laid siege to Vicksburg. Lee is going to try to draw Grant away from Vicksburg by invading the north. And as he leaves Virginia, he receives lots of support. Both Lee and Longstreet are pictured here in Berryville, Virginia. So we come to the plan for invasion. Lee was convinced that a victory on northern soil was necessary. First of all, because of the plight of Vicksburg. If Vicksburg falls, then the Confederacy is split in two and they lose control of the Mississippi River entirely. That would be catastrophic. And so Lee wants to draw Grant away. Secondly, there were growing shortages among his troops. Here's a picture taken of the Confederate infantrymen. And one of them said, "I have no seat in my pants. The legs are worn out. My shirt is literally rotted off me." Didn't mention that many of them didn't have shoes. So they're in bad condition. Lee knows something has to happen or he's going to lose his army because of all the shortages. Next, there was the possibility of discouraging Northerners into settlement of the conflict. Lee figures if he invades the North, the Northerners will become so afraid, disturbed over an invading army that they will pressure the government to stop the war. And a fourth reason for invading the North was the need for foreign intervention, either to get England and or France. The need for foreign intervention. So what Lee does is he proceeds from near Fredericksburg up this direction through Virginia, up through Maryland, and then he's going to head up into Pennsylvania. Now, all along the way, the Union Army doesn't know what Lee's doing. And so they're just kind of following along at a distance. Wherever Lee goes, they're going along, only a little further away. And we're going to see eventually they'll meet up at Gettysburg. Now, in marching through Maryland and Pennsylvania, Lee had given orders to his soldiers not to destroy property or to molest citizens. Lee believed in what's called the just war. You don't bother civilians and you don't destroy property. You only fight against armies. Lee had actually hoped to pick up some Marylanders as he's going through, because Maryland was very sympathetic to the cause, may have even voted for secession if Lincoln had not stopped their legislature from doing so. And so he hoped that as he's going through Maryland, that maybe he would pick up some fresh troops. However, when the Marylanders saw the condition of his soldiers, how thin they were, how poorly clothed, poorly equipped, and many of them barefoot, they decided not to join up after all, no matter what their sympathies were. As they reach Pennsylvania, Lee becomes aware that there is a shoe factory in Gettysburg. And so, being up in Pennsylvania, not too far away, he sends some troops over to Gettysburg to see if he can get some shoes for his soldiers. The new commander of the Union forces at this time, and end up clashing with an advanced unit of Federal soldiers. The new commander of the Union forces that replaced Hooker was General George Meade, who is pictured here. Now, this was not a plan. This was not part of the plan. No one planned to fight at Gettysburg. Lee just sent some guys over there to look for shoes. And Meade just sent some guys out there to scout where the Confederate Army is. And they just happened to meet at Gettysburg. They saw one another and started shooting. And then that brought more of the troops, and eventually we have the next day a battle forming. Let's look at some of the leaders that are going to be involved in this battle as the last thing today. In the Union Army, you can't read that very well, probably, but I'll just explain some of the people. Major General George Meade is the commander. Some interesting facts here about him. He actually was born in Spain, of a Philadelphia merchant who died when he was a young boy. Graduate of West Point, etc. Major General Abner Doubleday was the commander of the First Corps. If you've ever heard of Doubleday, you have heard him credited erroneously for inventing baseball. He did not. I'm not sure how that rumor got started even, but he's one of the generals here. Major General Daniel Sickles is the commander of the Third Corps. We're going to find he's going to have an effect on the battle. He is a political appointee. In other words, he got his position of Major General because he knew some people in government. We have Major General Oliver Howard, who's the commander of the 11th Corps, who was a devout Christian, considered resigning his commission to become a minister. Then we have Major General Alfred Pleasanton, commander of the Cavalry Corps. Now, what about the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Army? Well, you all know about General Robert E. Lee. You've been introduced to General James Longstreet, who was a very capable commander. Lieutenant General Ambrose Powell, or A.P. Hill, Jr., he has lots of names. A.P. Hill is what he's known as commander of the Third Corps. We saw him previously at Antietam. General Richard Ewell is the commander of the Second Corps, and Major General George Pickett. If you've never heard of him, you will become very familiar with him before this battle is over. So those are some of the major military leaders that we're going to find in this battle. I'll look at the uniforms of the two. Now, this is when it's new. None of the Confederates had new uniforms at this point, but this is what they looked like when they were issued, and here's how the Union soldiers were dressed. Tomorrow we'll begin looking at what happens in this most important battle, and probably the best known battle of the conflict between the states. And we'll take a day or two to look at it because it's very interesting. There's a lot of tactical information there to look at, and we also have a computer-generated explanation of the battle that I think you'll find interesting. For tomorrow, I want you to read Milliken, page 18. Read Milliken, page 18, and I'll have this on the board next period. Do questions 1 through 3. Then read pages 19 to 21, and do section 1 on page 22, and read page 23.
We don't have 18.
Is that on the back of something you've turned into me?
Yeah, yes.
All right, I'll see you later today. I'll get that back to you.
Wait, what is
Go ahead and do the rest of it, and then come back and do
it bad?
page 18. All right, so you're doing page 18, questions 1 to 3, read 19 to 21, do section 1 on page 22, and then read page 23.
Section